Today we're going to read The Moral Logic of Survivor Guilt, found on page 152 of your textbook. So please turn your textbook to page 152. We're going to first learn about the author. Nancy Sherman was born in 1951, always wanted to understand more about what her father went through as a soldier during World War II. Her opportunity came when she served as the first Distinguished Chair in Ethics at the U.S. Naval Academy from 1997 to 99. Sherman is now a university professor of philosophy at Georgetown University, and her research includes military ethics, the history of moral philosophy, and moral psychology. First, before we start reading, I want you to look at each of these words and I want you to rank them. One, you would put a 1 next to the word you know the best, a 2 next to the word you know the second best, and so on until you get to 6. These words are burden, culpability, conscience, remorse, entrusted, and empathetic. So now we'll turn to page 153 and begin reading the text. It's called The Moral Logic of Survivor Guilt. Traumatic events take a toll on the physical and mental well-being of the individuals who must endure them. Survivors of the Holocaust, rescue workers, and war veterans, for example, might wonder how they were able to make it out alive when others did not. The term survivor guilt is used to describe these feelings. So, we have talked about the mental well-being in the Seventh Man. So this text is also going to be talking about the mental well-being and what it takes to survive mentally, not just physically, but also mentally. So the survivor guilt is wondering how they were able to make it out alive when others did not. This is called survivor guilt. Just a reminder, you should be marking these up in your textbook as I am. We're on paragraph 1. If there is one thing we have learned from returning war veterans, especially those of the last decade, it's that the emotional reality of the soldier at home is often at odds with that of the civilian public they left behind. And while friends and families of returning service members may be experiencing gratefulness or relief this holiday, many of those they've welcomed home are likely struggling with other emotions. So this essay was originally published the day before 4th of July, so that's the holiday that she's referring to. So civilian public is anyone not in military or police service. So civilians would be someone who is not someone who is military or police. So when the soldier comes home, then they have different feelings than the people who have not experienced what they experienced. In the sense of responsibility soldiers feel toward each other, is the sense of responsibility soldiers feel toward each other irrational? High on that list of emotions is guilt. Soldiers often carry this burden home, survivor guilt being perhaps the kind most familiar to us. In war, standing here rather than there can save your life, but cost a buddy his. It's flukish luck, but you feel responsible. The guilt begins an endless loop of counterfactuals, thoughts that you could have or should have done otherwise, though in fact you did nothing wrong. The feelings are, of course, not restricted to the battlefield, but given the magnitude of loss in war, they hang heavy there and are pervasive, and they raise the question of just how irrational those feelings are. And if they aren't, what is the basis of their reasonableness? So, if it's a matter of flukish luck, why would some people feel responsible? So, why would some people feel responsible for their luck of being alive? So, one of the words I found here is counterfactual. And counterfactual, this word we can circle, and that definition means that it doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't seem to coincide with the facts. So the facts are that it was just luck that kept someone alive and killed someone else. But the fact that people feel guilty that they're alive is counterfactual. It doesn't make sense. So thoughts that you could have or should have done otherwise, though in fact you did nothing wrong. Okay, so this is what survivor guilt is thoughts that you could have or should have done otherwise, though in fact you did nothing wrong. That is why you feel survivor guilt. Okay, let's turn the page. Page 154. Captain Adrian Bonenberger, head of a unit in Afghanistan, pondered those questions recently as he thought about specialist Jeremiah Pulaski, who was killed by police in the wake of a deadly bar fight shortly after he returned home. Back in Afghanistan, Pulaski had saved Bonenberger's life twice on one day, but when Pulaski needed help, Bonenberger couldn't be there for him. When he was in trouble, he was alone, Captain Bonenberger said. When we were in trouble, he was there for us. I know it's not rational or reasonable. There's nothing illogical about it, but I feel responsible. So Adrian Bonenberger, Captain Bonenberger, felt that he was responsible for his friend's life, even though he was nowhere near his friend when his friend died. But for some reason, he felt responsible. But how unreasonable is that feeling? Subjective guilt associated with this sense of responsibility is thought to be irrational because one feels guilty despite the fact that he knows he has done nothing wrong. Objective or rational guilt, by contrast, guilt that is fitting to one's actions, accurately tracks real wrongdoing or culpability. Guilt is appropriate because one acted to deliberately harm someone or could have prevented harm and did not. Blameworthiness here depends on the idea that a person could have done something other than he did, and so he is held responsible or accountable by himself or others. So there's a lot there. Let's unpack that. So there's subjective guilt, is when you feel a sense of responsibility, even though it's irrational and you've done nothing wrong. And objective or rational guilt is when guilt that is fitting. It's when guilt is appropriate because one acted to deliberately harm someone. Okay, so you are considered worthy of blame depends on the idea that a person could have done something other than he did. So blameworthiness depends on the idea that a person could have done something other than he did. So if you could have acted differently and you did not, then that would be rational guilt. Irrational guilt is when you didn't have any choice, there's nothing you could have done differently, but you still feel guilty. But as Bonenberger's remarks make clear, we often take responsibility in a way that goes beyond what we can reasonably be held responsible for. And we feel the guilt that comes with the sense of responsibility. Nietzsche is the modern philosopher who well understood this phenomenon. Dashlele Gewissen, literally bad conscience. His term for the consciousness of guilt, where one has done no wrong, doesn't grow in the soil where we would most expect it, he argued, such as in prisons where there are actually guilty parties who should feel remorse for wrongdoing. In the genealogy of morals, he appeals to an earlier philosopher, Spinoza, for support. The bite of conscience, writes Spinoza in the Ethics, has to do with an offense where something has gone unexpectedly wrong. As Nietzsche adds, it's not really a case of I ought not to have done that. But what then is it a case of? Part of the reasonableness of survivor guilt, and in a sense its fittingness, is that it tracks a moral significance that is broader than moral action. Who I am in terms of my character and relationships, and not just what I do, matters morally. So let's underline this sentence. Of course, character is expressed in action, and when we don't walk the walk, we are lacking, but it is also expressed in emotions and attitudes. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, insists on the point. Virtue is concerned with emotions and actions. To have good character is to hit the mean with respect to both. Moreover, many of the feelings that express character are not about what one has done or should have done, but rather about what one deeply cares about. Though Aristotle doesn't himself talk about guilt, it is the emotion that best expresses that conflict. The desire or obligation to help frustrated by the inability, though through no fault of our own, to do so. To not feel guilt is to be numb to those pulls. It is that vulnerability, those pulls that Bonenberger feels when he says he wasn't there for Pulowski when he needed him. So there's a lot there. Let's unpack this. So what she's saying, Nancy Sherman is saying, is that character is expressed in action, but it's also expressed in emotions and attitudes. So character is expressed, I'm going to have no room to write this, in actions, but also in emotions and attitudes. So if someone falls down and hurts themselves and we don't have any feelings, we're just like, oh, whatever, then that might show that our character is not necessarily as moral as someone else who's like, oh, are you okay? I'm so sorry. Even if it's a stranger, you have no idea who the person is. If you just kind of go, oh, well, then maybe this is what this author is saying, that maybe this is an example of someone who does not have the strongest moral character. But if someone feels bad when someone else is hurt or injured, then that shows a genuine support for that person, and it shows that we care deeply about that person. So if I feel guilt, it's a way of showing I care. That's what she's saying there. Okay, so now we're above paragraph 7. The sacred bond among soldiers originates not just in duty, but in love. In many of the interviews I've conducted with soldiers over the years, feelings of guilt and responsibility tangle with feelings of having betrayed fellow soldiers. At stake is the duty to those soldiers, the imperative to hold intact the bond that enables them to fight for and with each other in the kind of sacred band that the ancients memorialized and that the Marine motto, Semper Fidelis, captures so well. But it is not just duty at work, it is love. So, the fact that soldiers feel so guilt, it's because they feel that they have a duty to protect each other, but they have also a love for their comrades, for their friends. Service members, especially those higher in rank, routinely talk about Service members, especially those higher in rank, routinely talk about unit members as my soldiers, my Marines, my sailors. They are family members, their own children of sorts, who have been entrusted to them. To fall short of unconditional care is experienced as a kind of a perfidy, a failure to be faithful. Of perfidy. Let's look that up. Okay, so perfidy means treachery, duplicity, untrustworthiness. Okay, I'll just put treachery. So to fall short of that unconditional care is experienced as a kind of treachery, a failure to be faithful. Survivor guilt piles on the unconscious thought that luck is part of a zero-sum game. To have good luck is to deprive another of it. The anguish of guilt, its sheer pain, as a way of sharing some of the ill fate. It is a form of empathetic distress. So, it's a form of empathy, of caring for another's. So guilt shows care, is what this author is saying. That's why we feel guilty, because we care so much about these people that are harmed, these soldiers. We care so much about them that we feel guilty when they die, even though it's not our fault. Many philosophers have looked to other terms to define the feeling. What they have come up with is agent regret, a term coined by the British philosopher Bernard Williams, but used by many others. The classic scenario is not so much one of good luck, as in survivor guilt, but of bad luck, typically having to do with accidents, where again, there's little or no culpability for the harms caused. In these cases, people may be causally responsible for harm. They bring about the harm through their agency, but they are not morally responsible for what happened. Causally responsible. So people may be the cause of the harm, but it isn't their fault. So imagine you're in a car accident and a car hits you from behind and your car hits the next car. And it was your car hitting the next car, because you have a really big car, that crumbled and hurt the people in the car in front of you. It wasn't your fault at all. It wasn't your cause of the accident, but the fact that your car was the one that did the damage, you feel guilty. You feel guilty for those people getting hurt. It was the car behind you's fault, but you're still feeling guilty. That's what it kind of means to say it's not your fault. The cause, you were the cause of the harm, but it isn't your fault. So it was an accident. But to my ear, agent regret is simply tone deaf to how subjective guilt feels. Despite the insertion of agent, it sounds as passive and flat as regretting the weather is bad, or more tellingly as removed from empathetic distress as the message sent to the next of kin after an official knock on the door. The Secretary of Defense regrets to inform you that, when it's really not very personal. Indeed, the soldiers I've talked to involved in friendly fire accidents that took their comrades' lives didn't feel regret for what happened, but raw, deep, unabashed guilt. And the guilt persisted long after they were formally investigated and ultimately exonerated. In one wrenching case in April 2003 in Iraq, the gun on a Bradley fighting vehicle misfired, blowing off most of the face of Private Joseph Mayak, who was standing guard near the vehicle. The accident was ultimately traced to a faulty replacement battery that the commander in charge had authorized. When the Bradley's ignition was turned on, the replacement battery in the turret, a Marine battery rather than an Army one, failed to shut off current to the gun. Mayak, who was 20, died. The Army officer in charge, then Captain John Pryor, reconstructed the ghastly scene for me in the failed attempts in the medic tent to save Mayak's life. He then turned to his feelings of responsibility. I'm the one who placed the vehicles. I'm the one who set the security. As with most accidents, I'm not in jail right now. Clearly, I was not egregiously responsible, but it is a comedy of errors. Any one of a dozen decisions made over the course of a 2-month period, and none of them really occurs to you at the time. Any one of those made differently may have saved his life. So I dealt with and still deal with the guilt of having cost him his life, essentially. There's probably not a day that doesn't go by that I don't think about it, at least fleetingly. What Pryor feels are feelings of guilt, and not simply regret that things didn't work out differently. He feels the awful weight of self-indictment, the empathy with the victim and survivors, and the need to make moral repair. If he didn't feel that, he would probably think of himself less of him as a commander. So he feels the awful weight of self-indictment and the need to make moral repair. In his case, moral repair came through an empathic, painful connection with Mayak's mother. After the fratricide is killing a comrade. So you kill, it's C-O-M-R-A-D-E. I didn't notice that hole there when I started writing it. So fratricide is killing someone who is either related to or very close to you. So in this case, it would be a comrade, someone who is connected to them as like in his charge. After the fratricide, Pryor and his first sergeant wrote a letter to Mayak's mother. And for some time after, she replied with care packages to the company and with letters. Oh, it was terrible, said Pryor. The letters weren't just very matter of fact. Here's what we did today. It was more like a mother writing to her son. Pryor had become the son who was no longer. It was her way of dealing with the grief, said Pryor. And so I had a responsibility to try to give back. In all this, we might say guilt, subjective guilt, has a redemptive side. It is a way that soldiers impose moral order on the chaos and awful randomness of war's violence. It is a way they humanize war for themselves, for their buddies, and us as civilians too. So let's underline these two lines. I think they're important. But if that's all that is involved, it sounds too moralistic. It makes guilt appropriate or fitting because it's good for society. It is the way we all can deal with war. Maybe instead we want to say it is fitting because it is evolutionarily adaptive in the way that fear is. But again, this doesn't do justice to the phenomenon. The guilt that soldiers feel isn't just morally expedient or species adaptive. It is fitting because it gets right certain moral or evaluative features of a soldier's world, that good soldiers depend on each other, come to love each other, and have duties to care and bring each other safely home. Let's underline that line before I continue. So good soldiers depend on each other, come to love each other, and have duties to care and bring each other safely home. Philosophers, at least since the time of Kant, have called these imperfect duties. Even in the best circumstances, we can't perfectly fulfill them. And so, what duties to others need to make room for, even in a soldier's life of service and sacrifice, are duties to self, of self-forgiveness and self-empathy. These are part of full moral repair. So we have these duties as soldiers to care for each other, to love each other, and bring each other safely home. But what happens when we can't bring our friends safely home? What happens when some of them don't come home and we feel guilty and we feel pain because of it? How do we get over that? How do soldiers get over that? So she's saying that soldiers have a duty to their comrades, but also to themselves to work on self-forgiveness. And we can connect this to the seventh man who spent 40 years living with the guilt of Kay's death. And he could have worked on forgiving himself, but instead he hid from that guilt and it made it worse. But if a soldier can learn to kind of talk through the guilt and to find ways to cope with it and to forgive themselves, then we may have fewer soldiers committing suicide when they come home after a war, because we may have fewer soldiers experiencing that survivor guilt that is so hard to deal with. And so not only do we have to worry about how can we survive physically when we're at war or in a survival situation, but how also can we survive emotionally? So these are the questions that we're answering in this unit. Okay, so don't forget that these comprehension check questions are going to be on your quiz for next week. There are 3 questions. I will be adding 2 more to make it 5 total, but if you did all of the annotations, you should do fine on the next 2 questions as well. But make sure to answer these questions so you're ready for these. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the video. Sorry it was a little long. Oops, I did the wrong button, but I will see you in class. Bye-bye.